is absolutely unique. We often want to present it as if Jesus' story is absolutely unique, and his birth stories are absolutely unique, but they're not. In fact, you've only got to read from the beginning of Luke's gospel to realize we often want to present it as if Jesus' story is absolutely unique, and his birth stories are absolutely unique, but they're not. In fact, you've only got to read from the beginning of Luke's gospel to realize that the nativity of John the Baptist is almost exactly. We often want to present it as if Jesus' story is absolutely unique, and his birth stories are absolutely unique, but they're not. In fact, you've only got to read from the beginning of Luke's gospel to realize that the nativity of John the Baptist is almost exactly the same as the nativity of Jesus. They are both anomalous pregnancies resulting in remarkable people. And those stories are modeled on an earlier story, a story from the Hebrew scriptures of another anomalous conception, another couple who can't naturally have children. That's the story of Abraham and Sarah. And through an encounter with a non-human entity, all of a sudden, Sarah is pregnant and they produce Isaac, and it's a whole new dawn in the human story. So modeled on that, we see Elizabeth, John's mum, has an encounter with a non-human entity, then comes the pregnancy. Mary, an encounter with a non-human entity, then comes the pregnancy. So Jesus' story isn't unique even within the Bible. It belongs to this family of stories of close encounters. And then through my research, I discovered for myself, this is actually a global pattern, that if you listen to the birth narratives associated with Vipassi Buddha, the 22nd incarnation of the Buddha before Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, or if you listen to narratives around the birth of the Yellow Emperor, same there. Narratives around the birth of Lao Tzu, same there. And this global family of stories we could call stories of star children, or stories of indigo children. And the theme is always the same, either an encounter with a non-human visitor, or an anomalous experience of light coming down from the sky and affecting the mother. And then the person who's born is highly intelligent, highly conscious, has a contribution that advances the human story in some kind of way. And if you don't place the narrative of Jesus's nativity in that wider context, how are you going to understand it? When we place it in that family, we realize that a statement is being made that the progress of humanity is being curated, that every so often we're given a helping hand, and the helping hand is coming from non-human others. So that, in terms of mythology, that's the context of the story of Jesus's arrival. And it may be a taboo to say that, but that's just a fact, that it belongs in that story of narratives. Some people might say, well, look, it's just a trope. It's just a literary device that's been dreamed up as a way of explaining why somebody is particularly clever or important. But you then have to ask, well, how did it become a trope? Why would people dream that up from culture to culture, century to century? Why do we have this concept of the star child? Why do we have this concept of external interventions to nudge human society forwards? And it's not just sort of our ignorant peasant ancestors who didn't know any better, who came up with these ideas and couldn't tell the difference between fact and fiction. You can find some of the greatest minds exploring these ideas. Yeah. And so Plato talks about the role of the gods, to use a translation of what he's saying, in advancing human society. Plato, one of the greatest minds in human history in terms of philosophy and science, he took very seriously the idea that we have non-human company very interested in the progress of the human race. And the story of Jesus fits squarely in the middle of that family of stories.
Yeah. And then we have in, I think, a couple of three different religions where they talk about the shining ones. Obviously, they were not human. They were something else.
Yes, the shining ones is a very interesting way of describing ancient helpers, and it's language we can find around the world. Now, sometimes the helpers, when they're identified, are identified that way. Sometimes they're identified in an almost opposite way. So the Babylonian story of ancient helpers is the one reported by the Babylonian Greek priest Berossus, who talks about the sages, the Apkallu, who came and taught our ancestors agricultural science, civil engineering, city building, money systems, banking systems, mathematics, science, all the accoutrements of civilization. But Berossus says that when our ancestors first saw the Apkallu, they were horrified and described these beings as some kind of monster. So you've got that at one end of the spectrum, some kind of monster, and then the beautiful shining ones at the other. But right across the spectrum of descriptions, the theme that repeats is non-human others who came and taught our ancestors how to survive and thrive and progress and become a civilization.
Yeah, I studied Berossus some, and he wrote another one. It's a history of the world, where he gleaned a lot from the Sumerian tablets where he created that document, and that is incredible reading what he wrote there.
That's right.
Yeah. And let's say, how did it start? Let's say for the construct of the Eden Enigma all the way up to now. How did you fit it all together? Did it come over a long period of time, or did you have bits and pieces that you tied together?
Yes, it really did evolve. I was really moved by my visit to Turkey last year and the places I visited and the history that they hold. And I knew I had to share something of that experience. And I thought, when I get home, I've got to write a travel book so that people can have the experience of going to these extraordinary places with me, because many of these places have yet really to explode in the world of international tourism in the way that, for instance, the sites of Sacsayhuaman or Pumapunku have exploded, or the Giza pyramids. Everybody knows about those. Everybody wants to go to those. And the sites in Turkey and Armenia are less well known, but every bit as important in helping us to understand the human story. And so I knew I wanted to share the experience, share those places, for it to feel like a travel book. But I knew that the really important thing that's here is the stories that the region has retained in the folklore and in these ancient carved symbols and in the cuneiform inscriptions left behind. And so I had to sit with those a long time and puzzle over. That's why I call it the Eden Enigma, because I'm puzzling over what's really an ancient code and wanting to decode what's the message in these symbols, what's the story underlying these symbols. And as I say, the region is known for stories of a global reset. So whether you're reading the biblical story of Noah or the Armenian history by Moses Koronatsai writing in the 400s, or whether you're listening to the Mesopotamian story of Ziusudra, or whether you're reading Greek and Roman historians talking about the beginning of the Iron Age in this part of the world, all these vectors, you might be reading Snorri Sturluson, the post-Viking chieftain who in the 1200s was writing the history of the Aesir, the gods of the Norse people. They all point to this part of the world. They all suggest a global reset and then a migration of agricultural sites and megalithic building from there around the world. Now, I knew something about those narratives. But as I went to these sacred sites and looked at these ancient symbols, I wanted to know, do these stories relate to those ones? Does the local hard copy evidence support these ancient stories? And I found that they do in the most incredible and detailed and specific way. That's the journey I share in the Eden Enigma.
Yeah, and you say these symbols, they outlast civilizations, they outlast religions. They are, yeah, okay, they're carved in stone.
They're set in stone, that's right. And one of the confronting things for me is, after 33 years in church-based ministry, I'm very familiar with the symbology of Christianity. So I'm very familiar with the cross and the sun cross, which is the cross in a circle. And you'll find the sun cross embossed onto the communion wafer. You'll find the sun cross on the ciborium that holds the communion wafers. You'll see the sun cross behind the heads of Jesus and Mary and the saints whenever they're portrayed in iconography. You will see the sun cross and a grand image of the sun in the monstrance that's held up for the Catholic ceremony of benediction. There are all these references to the sun cross. And somebody walking in who didn't know anything about high church Christianity would sit through some of these ceremonies and think, well, this is all about sun worship, which is how a lot of historians have interpreted this symbol, this cross in a circle, or this cross with circular edges, or the swastika, which is a cross with wings that suggests this rotational movement. But I found through my research that the ancients were not necessarily into what we would call sun worship, that their relationship with the sun was more intelligent and more sophisticated than that, and that the symbol also refers to artificial objects in the sky, and it ties into experiences of contact that changed human history. And this symbol representing craft, and we can get very specific, a craft large enough to carry 2 people, a craft that can land in a field, a craft that can be examined and touched by others, that's part of the symbological stories from out of Bronze Age Sweden. And we shouldn't be surprised to find the symbols there, says Snorri Sturluson, because they migrated there from the lands of ancient Armenia, Turkey and Armenia. We find the same symbols there. And so I just go into the mystery of that symbol, a symbol that I had thought Christianity had invented, but it actually inherited from these other stories that were thousands of years older than Christianity. And many of the associations that Christians have laid onto the cross, even those associations were there before Christianity. So the idea that this cross represents a being from the heavens, a being who is preeminent, a being to whom you will bring your tithes and offerings, all those associations are there before Christianity, and then they get imported in. So that's just one example of symbols that I was very familiar with that turned out to have a far longer story than ever I'd imagined.
Yeah. Yeah, you go quite deeply into those stories. And in fact, me being born in Norway, you even talk about Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic diplomat and politician and poet and writer. He pretty much had written the Viking history. I got 2 books of him on my shelf somewhere, and there's really interesting stuff.
Yes.
Vikings didn't write down much. They just didn't, but he did.
That's right. So the stories had been told for a long time, and then Snorri Sturluson, who really was a Renaissance man, we could call him, decided he needed to get a really good record of these stories for posterity. And it's through him that we know many of the Norse legends. I found it very interesting going to Snorri Sturluson after seeing some of the extraordinary sites in Turkey. And I should give a shout out to my friend David Lovegrove. He has a channel called Viking Superpowers. And this year he's publishing a book on the subject, Viking Superpowers. He's the one who got me onto Snorri Sturluson. And I realized that many of the phenomena I was seeing in Turkey, about from Armenia in the Eden Enigma, can be illuminated by what Snorri Sturluson had to say about those same symbols in the 1200s. And I'll give you an example. One of the places I went to in Turkey last year was right on the edge of the city of Van, a site halfway up a cliff, a giant doorway that's been carved into the limestone cliff face, and it's triple inset. And when you see the triple inset, you know that's a code for something. And it's really a code that's saying this is not the usual 3-dimensional kind of doorway. There's another dimensionality to this kind of doorway. And it's called a meher kapi, a light gate or a bright doorway. And the local mythology is that Haldi, the leader of the Tingir, and the Tingir were the advanced beings who came and helped their ancestors make the great leap forward into agriculture and city building, that Haldi and the other Tingir would come and go through bright doorways like this one. And when I first heard that story and saw the carving, and the local kings are very proud when they build a citadel, they'll say, I built this citadel and I built a light gate for Haldi, a bright doorway for Haldi. And as I listened to these stories and put them together, the story is, this is how the Tingir come and go. And I puzzled over what a light doorway is, why they would arrive on a beam of light. And initially I was thinking, oh, is this like a portal? Is this like a teleporting system? Is this like fairies arriving on a beam of light? Or is this like the beaming system of Star Trek? That was where I went to when I first heard the stories. But then when I went to Snorri Sturluson, he tells the story of King Svegdir, who one day finds an anomalous object on his property. He describes it as a boulder that he's never seen before, but this smooth boulder is about the size of a house. Oh. And then a door opens in it, and there's a bright beam of light that comes out from that door. And then King Svegdir goes in with another being into the boulder and is never seen again. Now, let's just picture this. Here's this object the size of a house, and when the door opens, there's bright light. Well, in a culture that has never seen artificial lighting, if you see a craft that has artificial lighting and they open the door, that's exactly what you're going to see. Really intense bright light, and that's where the Tingir come from. And then when they return home, they'll go back through that doorway into the bright light again. And so putting this alongside other aspects of Urartian story, I think we've got a memory of ancient technology, a memory of artificial lighting, and a memory of advanced people coming and going in craft that had artificial lighting. Yeah. And it's a motif you can find in other ancient story that I think a coherent picture begins to build up. And sometimes we can miss the language of ancient technology because we're so habitual to folklore as if it's a metaphor or as if it's a moral story or a fable of some kind. But the moment you listen to the stories and picture it and then ask, what did I just see? That's when we realize there are other ways of describing these things. So that's just one, for instance, of how this family of story hints at contact with advanced others in the deep past.
Yeah, when he said boulder, when you see something strange like that, you have to associate with something that fits in your paradigm. So, well, it's big, it's round, it's a boulder, right? No, did we
Exactly.
spell UFO? I mean,
Yes.
that's probably what it was.
I can give you another example of that. How would you describe a flying saucer 3,000 years ago? Well, if you look at carvings, you could go into Persia, for instance, to the palace of Ashur-nasirpal II, and exquisite carvings of Tingir and Apkallu and deities, beings that archaeologists often refer to as genies. You look at those carvings and you will see